Welcome, everybody, and apologies for the slightly delayed start there. This is the 35th consecutive talk in the University of Buckingham Great Minds, Great Lives evening fireside talks. And tonight we have one of the greatest interpreters of Shakespeare alive, one of the great Shakespeare figures of the whole post-war era, the sixth artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company in only 60 years. Greg, it's absolutely wonderful to have you on. And can you just begin? Can I just say that one of the joys, the compensations of an online session is we can get many more in. We were 2,000 of you welcomed, everybody, waiting to look at this. Will be many more now. Please ask questions, by the way. They on Teams, just tap them in and I'll put them to Greg. One of the joys is that rather than us coming to the writer, the director, the creator, them coming to us in a tent or a marquee lecture hall, we're coming to them. And Greg, tell us about the space that you're in. What is this room?
This is my study here in Stratford-upon-Avon. The artistic director gets a house. It's a bit like being the chancellor or something. So this is a little 1916 cottage. And in this room, I have my study and most of my books, and the odd bust of Shakespeare alongside it. So yeah, these tend to be the Shakespeare books on that side, and yeah, and then there are bits of memorabilia all over, hanging on the walls, and I have a print of the heroes of the Trojan War, which was given to John Barton by Peggy Ashcroft. Wow. She's written on the back, and when John sadly died a couple of years ago, his sister passed it on to me. So I'm very privileged to have that, and indeed John's complete works, which is exactly like...
Open it out, just so we can just see. Let's look at it there. Yeah.
It's absolutely just like John, a complete mess in terms of, it's got notes in it, it's got lots of tabs and scribblings and all the rest of it. So and it still smells of John Barton's flat. So I'm very, very honoured to have that.
And tell everyone what you've just been doing, which is part of the rich variety of tasks that you have as artistic director.
Well, precisely like you, Anthony, we trying to respond to not being performing, of course, because our theatres can't be open, as you know. So we've moved a lot of stuff online, and we have some very loyal donors and patrons and stakeholders who normally would be coming to Stratford and seeing the plays and attending events and what have you. So we decided to do some online, and I just basically phoned some mates and said, would you talk about Shakespeare with me for an hour on a Monday evening? And we started a couple of weeks ago with Judy Dench, who, of course, was completely delightful. And then Ray Fearon spoke to me last week, and the great pleasure of talking to Harriet Walter for the last hour. And Harriet and I have done... Well, I've known Harriet since I saw her at the Duke's Playhouse in Lancaster as a schoolboy, playing Goody Proctor in The Crucible, and thinking that was the most glorious thing, and how she inhabited that role. And then was lucky enough to be in the season in Stratford with her when she played Viola and Imogen, among other things. And then lucky enough to get to direct as Lady Macbeth, and then as Beatrice, and then as Cleopatra as well.
And can those listening this evening, Greg, tune in? We're always keen to have many more people taking part in Royal Shakespeare Company events. Can
Yes, you can.
have
You,
a website?
you register for them and online, and they're every Monday night. Next week is Patrick Stewart beaming in from LA. Harriet's Mark Antony, indeed. David Tennant talking about the various things that we did together, including Hamlet. Adjoa Ando. Patterson Joseph, Simon Russell Beale, the list goes on, and for me it's a total joy because I get to chat with people about their insights into playing all those extraordinary parts.
Your life, Greg, which is what we're now going to be going through, has been so deeply imbued with Shakespeare and the theatre from a very early age. At the age of 6 months, you moved from Yorkshire to Lancashire. Was that an ideological move?
Well, I've both a white rose and a red rose. I'm a sort of pink rose, I guess. No, my father. I was born in Huddersfield, and then my dad shifted jobs from ICI to the Atomic Energy Authority, and we moved to Preston because of that. And my twin and I were 6 months old. Yeah. So it was so that's no. I don't think I had any choice in the matter, I have to say.
You went to a Jesuit Catholic junior and then senior school and took to acting in a whole range of productions. Lady Macbeth, Malvolio, Lady Anne, Mrs. Malaprop. What was it? Can you remember what it was about theatre and Shakespeare that really started to engage and move you?
I guess theatre was. My mum was a member of the Women's Institute in Longton, which is just outside Preston, and they did an what they call the elderly people's concert every year in the village hall down Marsh Lane, and I was taken along to see it very, very early on. And they were a very inspirational and inspiring group, this particular WI, because the final scene of every concert every year was a fluorescent scene with UV lighting. And I remember this particular one, the first one I ever saw was the music was a country garden, in a country garden, and all the assembled ladies of the WI dressed as flowers were sort of sitting on stage singing, and all the colours sang out. And in the centre of the stage were these two statues of a sort of a man and a woman in a kind of Edwardian dress, just frozen there as statues. And then at some point in the action, the statues got off their plinths and danced with each other, and I couldn't believe it. They were statues, and now they were dancing, and it looked so magical and amazing in this weird purple light. I think I was grabbed from a point of view of theatre from that very point, and Shakespeare came later when my dad used to get box sets from Reader's Digest, I think, of kind of classical records, and I think he got Beethoven symphonies, maybe something like that. And was a little sort of taster or sort of tester, was a 45 RPM record of the incidental music to Midsummer Night's Dream, interspersed with some American actors doing extracts from the play, and I just knocked my socks off. They're just taking you into this wood, not only with Mendelssohn's music as the fairies come dashing in. I think Mendelssohn described it as being like leaves blown across a summer lawn, and the glissando of that extraordinary music as the fairies arrive. Well, I mean, I was not only for music but for the sense of that language. Grabbed me immediately, and bottom stomping around in the brass and braying like a donkey, and then Oberon saying, "I know a bank where the wild thyme blows." I guess it was the first time I had ever heard that particular speech, and it had a kind of incantatory spell. It just, I was the bug bit, and that was it. That was me. And then, as you said, I was very lucky to go to this Jesuit college in Preston, and they did a Shakespeare play every year. They didn't let the girls. My sister was at the convent next door across the road, but the girls weren't allowed to be in the plays. So I got my break playing.
But your head teacher was quite enlightened. We'll come on to him in a moment. But the Poor Players was a company that you set up when you were still at school, and you directed Twelfth Night and Comedy of Errors, was it? I mean, that's very unusual for somebody still at school.
Well, yeah, I suppose it was. It all started with, I had my still very best friend Richard lived in Chorley, and I used to get the train over to Chorley, and we would wander around Astley Park in Chorley, which had this very, very fine sort of Jacobean, well, I guess late Elizabethan with Jacobean alterations, this beautiful house called Astley Hall. And in the centre was this Elizabethan courtyard, and it said it was dated 1600. And we had just done Twelfth Night at school, and I thought, let's do Twelfth Night here. So we put it together. It was a mammoth and ludicrous undertaking, and far too big, but anyway, we did it, and it was great fun. So and the only way of putting it on was to direct it. I mean, I also played Malvolio, of course, but the only way it was going to happen was if we made all the costumes. And I'd been to Stratford by that point, but not to see a play. But I had seen an exhibition in what is now the Swan Wing. I think they must have very recently done the Revenger's Tragedy, the one that Trevor Nunn did with Ian Richardson, the black and silver one. And there was an exhibition of how they had created the effects on the costumes. And I remember to this day that it was called gunking, and it involved splattering an old felt hat with glue and then sort of spraying it with sort of Humbroil car spray, and creating this wonderful and building up these rich textures, which of course I just went home and borrowed my mother's doilies and sprayed through with car spray paint, and I just thought that was the most, just the creation of this. I have to say, I mean, because they'd Keith Michel as Henry VIII and the Six Wives had been on the telly, and there'd been an exhibition of costumes which had come round to Preston, I think, and my friend Richard and I had been to see these costumes and realised that all those jewels on Henry VIII's great collar were actually made of fruit pastels and washers and things. I just thought that was amazingly inventive and clever.
And here was a turning point in your life. I mean, you were extraordinarily precociously intelligent and culturally engaged, and your head teacher, Father Wren, might well have directed you towards Oxbridge. I mean, every head teacher wants their students to go to Oxbridge, not necessarily because it's good for them, that might well be, but it's great for the school. But he said, no, Bristol. And you went off to the university and studied English and drama.
I did. I think it was very unlikely. I have no idea that I would have got to Oxbridge. Oxford was the where Catholic college students seem to go, and I sort of felt as though that maybe I was taken aback by the advice, but it was really, for me, really excellent advice, because Bristol, I immediately fell in love with Bristol as a city, and the course, certainly the drama course, just fitted me like a glove. I mean, it was because it was a mixture of absolutely practical. So I designed the show, I was in shows, I directed shows, but there was, alongside that, there was the study of drama with people like Professor Glyn Wickham and Martin White and some really brilliant minds. So for me, it was the perfect the perfect way in. I mean, I knew when I finished the degree that I still hadn't. There was still much more to learn, and I'd run the Poor Players, which we had continued in the summer holidays. I managed with a maths student called Chris Grady. He and I got together and decided that we would run the Poor Players in the summer holidays, but we would get students from universities and drama schools all over the country and all come together to do a play, and managed to persuade a computer company to give us the astonishing amount of £30,000 to tour the country, which this was 1979, so this was Mrs. Thatcher had just come in, and the responsibility for subsidy of the arts was to fall to public sponsorship. So they didn't know what they were doing, and we didn't really know what we were doing, asking for £30,000 for a student tour. But what I learned was that the university students all felt that the drama school students somehow knew this thing called technique, and they couldn't quite get to the bottom of it, nor could they seem to achieve it. Whereas the drama school students all thought the university students were just too cerebral and weren't thinking about, the effect of the language upon them physically and all those things. And I thought, well, I need to marry the two together.
How just is that? And does that divide still hold some truth?
I think to some it does. I think it does depend on the courses these days. But I think, and of course, many drama schools now are degree courses, so it sort of marries the two, I guess. But I certainly felt that there was something I didn't know about technique, which I needed to know if I was to really understand the craft and the discipline of the profession I wanted to enter.
So you stayed on in Bristol to the Old Vic and trained as an actor. Was that how you saw your life? And then you were then invited to upstate New York the following year to direct The Dream. So already clashes between acting and directing.
Yeah.
How did you resolve it?
Well, it's I think I had started directing, as I say, in order to put the plays on and be in them. And that was the buzz that I got. But that buzz had started to wane to some extent, in that I realized that I was casting other people in my head before I was casting me, and that's quite a good sign. And I partly it was pragmatic. When I finished my training, I applied for what was then called the Regional Theatre Trainee Directors Scheme, and I managed to get a place as an assistant director at Nottingham Playhouse. But they said, look, we actually can't start this for another 6 months, but presumably if you've done an acting course, you act. So, and I said, well, presumably I did. So I went to do 6 months acting at Nottingham. And so it was balancing both things all the time. And it indeed was still doing that when the RSC rang one day and said, come to Stratford as an actor.
And that was in 1987. And it was Solanio and it was Octavius Caesar. And then the following year you became an associate director. Did you sense, Greg, that you would go further as a director than as an actor?
I read a piece of Flaubert. No, I think in fact I read Flaubert's Parrot by Julian Barnes, in which, as I remember, Flaubert is quoted as saying, most people end up in life doing what they do second best. And implied from that, therefore, you better decide what you do first best and do it. And I think my ego wanted to stay, I wanted to be in all those Merchant Ivory films and play floppy-haired young men. But Rupert Graves had cornered the market rather in that. So I think I also realized that I would have more control of my career potentially as a director than as an actor, and seeing the very brilliant actors around me and young actors of then my age, like Linus Roach and indeed like Mark Rylance, who was playing Romeo, when I then took over as an assistant director. And I realized that really my brain was a director's brain, that I wanted to think about the whole. And it partly came about, we did a production of Ben Jonson's rarely done play, The New Inn. I'm not sure it's a play that needs to be done much more either, frankly, but there was a crisis. The director was temporarily unavailable. We had to carry on rehearsing, and I found myself kind of, and the cast included John Carlyle and Fiona Shaw and Deborah Finlay. I mean, some extraordinary people. And we were doing one scene, and I started sort of suggesting how it might work or what we could try. And at the end of the season, the casting director called me in, as they would do. And instead of saying, well, we think you should play Hamlet next year, they said, well, the associate directors had got together and wondered whether I should think about being an assistant director, and there was a position, and would I like to do that? And it was like my nose was, I was just following my nose really. And it seemed like the right moment and the right time to do it. And at that point, I stopped acting as a career, and never missed it.
And now you were 30. Just say what you have. What is the craft of the director, and how are you a better and different director now, Greg, 32 years on, than you were when you first became assistant director at RSC?
Well, the great thing about being an assistant director is that you get to see other directors do it. And because often as a director, you don't. Other actors have seen lots of other directors work, but many directors haven't seen how other directors do it. And as an assistant, I was able, to work with brilliant people like Terry Hands and Bill Alexander and John Caird, as well as be in rooms with Peter Hall and Trevor Nunn and Adrian Noble, of course. So I was partly I was kind of going, I must remember as a director that I should do that, and remember never to do that, and I think I realized that directing was not about having all the answers. And I think as a young director, that's a danger. You start by thinking, I've got to know everything, every move, I've got to work it all out. And you don't. You just have to have to know the right questions to ask. And I found that was a profoundly different response. And I guess I also realized that to begin with, as a director, you are a facilitator. The three big things that I think I go into rehearsal having done, the three great tasks we should have accomplished. One is to cast the play, and Tyrone Guthrie, who was a great Shakespeare director in the 1940s and 50s, he said, directing is 80% good casting, and to some extent he's right. And the next thing I will have done I will have looked at the play and thought about it and probably cut it. To go into rehearsals with a cut text is always a thing that I feel very important. And then to negotiate it after that, having made some choices. And then the third is to design it with your designer. But really what you're doing is creating an environment in which those actors can flourish. And the first Shakespeare I directed at Stratford was Henry VIII, which all is true, which had been described. I mean, when I told my partner Tony Sher that Adrian had offered me Henry VIII, he said, run, don't do it, because nobody's ever made the play work. And Howard Davis, who had been the previous director to direct it in 1983 with a very good cast of Richard Griffiths and John Thaw and Gemma Jones, he had said that he had been at an associates meeting where they all divvied up who was directing what the following year. And he happened to go to the loo, and when he came back, he'd been given Henry VIII. Whether it was a poison chalice or not, for me, it wasn't, because what I learned, having acted in the Swan and indeed having been assistant director to Terry Hands in the Swan particularly, was how that theatre worked, and in a way how Shakespeare worked too, by being a live conversation with its audience. And I think
explain that.
Terry was rehearsing Juliet's potion scene, where Friar Lawrence has given her the sleeping potion, which will make her seem as though she's dead and be put in the tomb, and Romeo will come back. And she's trying to debate whether suddenly she sort of says, what if this be a poison that the friar subtly hath given me to make me dead? And Terry said to the actress playing Juliet, who are you talking to? And she said, well, myself. And Terry pointed around the Swan Theatre where we were rehearsing, which, for those of you who don't know, it obviously is a thrust stage and a galleried auditorium, a very beautiful, mellow space. And he pointed around and said to her, so who are all these people? And she said, well, the audience. And he said, no, they're your sounding board, they're your friends, they're your confidants. Talk to them. So she took the potion again, and she went, why if this be a poison? The friar subtly hath ministered to have me dead. And I, sitting there as the assistant director, went, I don't know, because suddenly I was complicit. I was not just sitting there in the dark, thinking about this poor girl and her dilemma. She was asking me what to do, and I felt drawn in. And it was one of the most brilliant pieces of revelation for me about how Shakespeare works and how he grabs you. So that was a really valuable piece of advice for me, trying to know how to work it in that particular space.
So Adrian Noble was very important. That it was 96 with Jane Lapotaire, wasn't it? Henry VIII. Back in 92, he'd made possible Homer's Odyssey, where you'd used Derek Walcott.
Yeah, that was a real piece. And one of the things that people always say about this profession is that you need a degree of luck. Talent. Simon Callow once said, you have to have the talent for having talent. You have to have, and there is going to be luck, and sometimes you make that luck, and sometimes that luck just happens. Well, luck just happened in that Adrian, who had always been in the company, when I was in Stratford, he was at the Barbican, so we hadn't quite crossed over. And then when Terry resigned and Adrian took over, I didn't really know Adrian too well, but I went and talked to him, and he said, well, come on, then what do you want to do? And I said, well, what I really want to do is an adaptation of the Odyssey, because I just loved the story of the Odyssey, and I thought it could make a great piece. And he said, this is the luck. He said, oh, well, I'm thinking of doing the Thebans in the Swan, and the great story of Oedipus, 3 plays, and actually that might be really good as a kind of companion complementary piece in the TOP. So why don't you think about it, do a workshop, get a writer, and Colin Chambers, who was then the literary manager at the RSC, said, do you know Derek Walcott's work? And I did, but not very well, the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott. And so with great kind of chutzpah, we wrote to Derek and said, what about doing an adaptation of the Odyssey? He had done his great epic poem Omeros, which is a sort of shift the Odyssey to the setting of the Caribbean. And Derek, to my astonishment, said, yep, I'd love to do that. And we did a workshop in Stratford, and then another one in London, and it looked as though it was coming together. And then Derek said, okay, well, said to Adrian Noble, well, look, Greg, I have now done 2 workshops for you in Stratford and London. It's about time Greg now did a workshop with me. And Adrian said, fine, where? He said, well, St. Lucia, obviously. So I was sent out to St. Lucia in the Caribbean for 10 days to work with Derek Walcott. And for most, I'd say for at least 8 of those days, we seemed to sit on the beach and just feel the tidal pull. But I learned so much about his poetry and how it works and what his take was going to be on Homer. So that was, and after we did it, I then went back to Trinidad, where he ran the theatre workshop, which did most of his early plays, and did the Odyssey there. And as a result of that, the great carnival designer Minshall decided that for Carnival that year, he would do the Odyssey. And I found myself a year later shipping around Port of Spain as one of Circe's pigs in the Odyssey. And it was an extraordinary. There's a great poem called Ithaca by the Greek poet Cavafy, who basically says, when you set out on your journey to Ithaca, pray that the journey is a long one, full of adventures of Lystragonians and Cyclopses. Because when you get to Ithaca, all that Ithaca will give you is a stony little island. And I found that profoundly important in my life, in that it's not, because I think from when I was young, it was all about, oh my God, I'm not going to make it as a director, or I'm not going to make it in this profession, and look at all these other people who are streaking past and having huge careers. And the Ithaca and the time on St. Lucia with Derek, and Cavafy's poem taught me it's about the journey there. It's not about getting there. It's about what you learn and how you absorb and how you are in the moment of the journey as you pass through it.
In the moment, a core Greg sentiment. Something else very important in your life, 1995, Johannesburg, directing Tony, and tell us about that direction in Titus Andronicus, and what that relationship has given you artistically as well as more roundedly. Well,
so Tony and I had met in that season where I was playing Salanio and he was playing Shylock, and I had to beat him up every night, as a nasty Christian as I was, and then, dear reader, I married him. I admired him immensely as an actor, and we started walking out in that season, and then eventually we were invited, along with a group of actors, directors, writers, etc., from the National Theatre Studio, right at the end of apartheid, to do a workshop at the Market Theatre in Johannesburg. And it was a great privilege to do that, and to see, to work with people like John Carney and Barney Simon, who was still alive, one of the founders of the theatre, and Janice Honeyman, and to work with those actors. And we did bits of Shakespeare, and we did all sorts of things. And as a result of that, Tony, who of course is South African, was invited, Barney Simon and John Carney invited he and I to come back the following year to do a Shakespeare play at the Market. And Tony had never performed professionally in his own country, because, of course, of apartheid. And because he'd come over to train over here and made his career over here in the UK, and so he'd never been back. We decided that the play we wanted to do was Titus Andronicus. It's probably a crazy idea, but it felt to us that it is not just a play about a kind of grand guignol of bloody violence. It's actually, in the end, it becomes a plea for reconciliation. As Marcus Andronicus at the end says, has a wonderful speech about pulling together this scattered corn into one mutual sheaf, which was an image that sort of really seemed to speak to South Africa, that had experienced decades of terrible violence, and that somehow this was a kind of cathartic experience. So, and I remember it being the most vivid experience working with fantastic South African actors like Dorothy Ann Gould and Selomake Kakube, who played Air on the Moor. And just the way that their experience of violence, it's sort of something that Cisberia used to talk about, was that you had to honor the violence. These people had a real experience. It wasn't entertainment. For them, it was a vivid and real, and that somehow we needed to put that into the play. And it was I guess one of the greatest experiences of my life, really, and of course of directing Tony for the first time, and which we didn't work together terribly well to begin with, and threw plates at each other, and eventually worked out that we had to make some ground rules. We couldn't talk about it at home unless we asked permission to do so, and that sort of thing. So it was an extraordinary political experience in my life, and also seeing the power of Shakespeare to sort of transcend barriers and to speak so vividly to so many people of such widely different experience.
An amazing time to be in South Africa as the relationship was taking off, and you've had so many extraordinary creative partnership relationships with Tony Sher. What would you highlight for the audience today, Greg?
I probably, just having talked to Harriet Walter, but I loved doing Macbeth with the two of them. I had a particular pleasure doing Othello, because Antony played Iago, and the heir on Selomake played Othello in The Swan. And I learned something about, which I thought was I now use a lot in directing, which is to identify the crossroads in any character's journey.
What do you mean by that?
So we've read the play, so we know that character at that point isn't going to make the choice, this choice or that choice. He's going to do that. So Romeo is whereas if you examine those crossroads and see what those choices are at that moment, and then make the character make that choice rather than just dashing across that crossroads, then there is tension in the piece. And Othello was a particularly exciting for me, was the way that Tony played him as the great improviser. I've seen productions which can get rather stultifying, because you sort of think Othello hasn't got a chance, Iago's running rings around him, there's no tension. I know he's going to win. Whereas in fact there are lots of points, lots of crossroads, where, because we know Iago has another idea and follows another route and is successful, we don't examine the moment when he might go, I'm going to be pulverized by this guy. This was a really bad idea. I must give up, or whatever. And the beat where that dawned upon me was in the middle of that great, one of the greatest scenes in literature, isn't it? 3-3 in Othello, where Iago is spinning his web around Othello, and Othello is resisting. And it looked as though he just basically pummeled Iago and threatened him. And it looked as though Iago was going to lose. And Tony did this thing. Tony's in rehearsal, gets very worked up and sweats a lot. And he pulled out the hanky from his pocket and wiped his brow, and then realized it was the one with the spotted with strawberries that Desdemona, and popped it back again and said, "Have you ever seen a handkerchief spotted with strawberries in your wife's hand?" And from that, trifle light as air, was to the jealous confirmations true as Holy Writ, and it was so spontaneous. It just came out of that moment of rehearsal, and it suddenly made sense. I remember he did almost exactly the same thing as Macbeth. There was a moment in what we called the bunker scene where he's trapped, he's stuck there in Dunsinane, and Birnam Wood is about to come make its way to Dunsinane. And the cream-faced loon tells him that Lady Macbeth has died, and he descends into this slough of despair, this pit of despair. And Tony in one rehearsal just gave up and just walked out of the room. And the actor the messenger came bouncing on, ready to do his next bit. And the room was kind of electrified for a moment of, where's Tony Shergon? Or what's Macbeth doing? And then he wandered back in and asked him what his news was. And what Shakespeare does in that scene, especially in the moment where he talks about a poor player strutting and fretting his hour upon the stage, going back to the poor player, is he reminds us in Act 5 that this is just an actor on a stage, strutting and fretting. And somehow he renews the contract with the audience. He sort of renews our contract and to believe this is happening, even though we know it's an actor and it's fake blood and all those things. He renews that contract and somehow reinforces it through that last act, so that we become even more kind of engaged with it, even more prepared to suspend our disbelief. And I thought that was a kind of astonishing way that Tony had somehow never talked about it, just did it, that somehow he had intuited that by reminding us that he is an actor, that Macbeth reminding us that he's actually just an actor playing it, the crossroads was that he could give up. He could just walk off stage and stop. It didn't always happen. He didn't every time do it in the performance, but just so it didn't get settled into a bit of business. It was always spontaneous and fresh and immediate. But it taught me a great deal about how actors can keep Shakespeare's plays so alive by bringing their hearts and minds and souls to it, and all that technique, and somehow fusing that together. So it has been, of course, a great joy of my life that, alongside everything else, I've been able to work with people like Tony and indeed all the other actors who've taught me such a lot about what it is to be an actor and what it is to use the heightened language that Shakespeare gives you.
So then in 2012, this will be the last question. There's so many questions that are coming up on the screen. You became the 6th artistic director, long line, Peter, Paul, Trevor, Nunn, Greg Hands, Terry Hands, Adrian Noble, then Michael Boyd, who we haven't mentioned. They've all had their own, looking back at them, they've had their own particular stamps. What is going to be, obviously there's COVID at the, now, but what are you shaping? You've had this extraordinary run at the Canon. Just a moment or two reflection on your own particular mark.
Gosh, I really, I don't know that I can answer that, except to say that I think the one thing that made the most difference was to decide that we were going to work through the canon, through the whole canon, in an arc, and not, as they say on Just a Minute, you know, without repetition, hesitation, or deviation, and which meant that the currency of each of those titles as they came up was stronger. That, you know, there was a decade when we did 5 Romeo and Juliets, and that's just reducing the currency of those plays, I think. And being able to work through that canon has been a great joy, and of course, indeed interrupted by COVID, but we hope resumed as soon as we possibly can. But I hope it's about maintaining the craft, and keeping the productions and the plays as resonant in this particular moment, whether that's Me Too or Black Lives Matter or whatever. You know, that you don't have to make Shakespeare relevant, because he's like, as many people have said, he's like a magnet that attracts all the iron filings of what's going on in the world. He will respond to the world in whatever you do with him or to him. But yeah, I hope maintaining the degree and the level of craftsmanship that those plays require.
And which play has most surprised you doing it in the canon, seeing them in sequence?
Well, weirdly, Two Gentlemen of Verona.
Why?
Because we haven't done it when Simon Godwin did his production in the first full year of my regime. We hadn't done it in full performance on the RST stage for 45 years, really. And by trusting that play and its extraordinary Ovidian language, it became a complete joy. It was a hit. It's nearly sold out. It was a joy, some lovely performances, and a sort of freshness to it, which did surprise me. And I know that some of my team were kind of worried that, you know, was Two Gentlemen of Verona going to sell out, bearing in mind that my first memory of Two Gentlemen of Verona was in a double bill with Titus Andronicus, directed by John Barton in sort of 1981. But it did. Maybe we just dusted the feathers off that. But yeah.
So stacks of questions going to come straight in with Barry Morse, who says, in the light of the canon, what do you think is Shakespeare's greatest work, and are you prepared to commit yourself? You've been asked that question many times.
Well, it tends to be the one I'm working on.
Yeah, that's just like the authors we have on, when they're asked what their greatest work is, they'll always say my last one or the current one.
I mean, I think Midsummer Night's Dream and Macbeth are well nigh perfect plays. I find my desire to go back to Dream every few years. I genuinely haven't repeated the plays. I've been working my way through the canon and now have just a handful still to do. But and that's what's so extraordinary about the plays, because they take you into different worlds, such different worlds. Each play is so different.
And question now, a student's question, asking about the 2018 production of Macbeth. I'm sure many people saw that. Was that the Polly Findlay one? Why, she says, were the three witches depicted as children?
Well, I guess you'd have to ask Polly Findlay that. In essence, I guess what Polly was doing partly was using the sort of language of film thriller to some extent, and you know, there's those spooky kids in The Shining, for instance, that kids can have a very dangerous and their presence can be quite terrifying in those contexts. And I think that's what Polly was looking for. It is always difficult doing the witches. It's a bit like, you know, it's a bit like Exit Pursued by Bear. You know, the problem is not Exit Bear. The problem is Enter Bear. That's always the challenge: is how are you going to do that? How are you going to be tick off that one? So yeah, that was a particular choice. It's not my job as artistic director. I could to question, yes, but not to insist.
And question from Amy Jones, who's head of drama at the Royal Latin School, says, Greg, what can I say to pupils who say it's so boring and what's the point? And Diana says, how can we change the mindset of teenagers who say they hate Shakespeare and don't want to study a play for English GCSE, but have to?
Oh, it's so hard, isn't it? I mean, in Stratford, we have a very brilliant education team who basically apply the techniques we use in a rehearsal room to the classroom. So it's about getting them on their feet. It's about exploring the plays. It's not necessarily just reading it around the class. It's about doing it. I mean, that Shakespeare was writing to be performed. Essentially, not to be sort of just read, and it's a real challenge. I can absolutely see that, but I think what the work our education department does, and the techniques that they use, which you can find online on our website, are really inspiring to young people that they will work with, and have been transformational, I think, in many teachers' response to how they can inspire kids to love Shakespeare. And then there's a point where you go, well, there's not everybody is going to love Shakespeare, and he did write language that was 400 years old, and sometimes it's a bit difficult to understand. I would say embrace the difficulty, but because it seems to me, I find that when I've worked with kids on Shakespeare, that nobody's told them it's difficult. So they quite often, their responses are much more spontaneous, and they respond to it. I think I was lucky in that I looked at the plays as parts that I could play and shows that I could be in, not things that I had to study to produce an essay in an exam.
A question from another drama teacher, Greg, your views on the great films, and why did Zeffirelli, Romeo, what was so magical about that? Could others be as magical, particularly in setting a light, a flame in young people?
I loved the Zeffirelli film when I saw it at school, but I also loved the Baz Luhrmann film for completely different reasons. In that it suddenly it was sexy. That's good. That gets lots of people's interest. It was fast. It was hot-blooded. I think that both of those films are brilliant. I think sometimes the challenge with the films is that they sort of ditch the language. As I always think of the chorus in Henry V, think when we talk of horses that you see them printing their proud hooves in the receiving earth. And of course on film, if it says there's a horse, you've got to see a horse. So there are challenges about film, but I've loved Shakespeare on film, and indeed the adaptations of Shakespeare, like West Side Story and the like. But yeah, I think film is a great way of engaging with Shakespeare. It's whatever can hook you. I was hooked on the classics. Indeed, the reason I did the Odyssey, I think, because of the stop animation, the clay figures in Jason and the Argonauts, that wonderful Harry Hockhausen adaptation of Jason and the Argonauts. So that's what hooked me, not hearing great poetry to begin with. I was hooked by those skeletons fighting Jason and the Argonauts. So however you get that, whether it's the little animated Shakespeares or however you connect, the point is to connect.
Time for two more questions. We'll finish at 5 past because we started just a bit late. Question from Jane, who says, I find that as I grow older, I understand Shakespeare in different ways. Am I unusual? Is that your experience, Greg? What are the how does that work?
I think Shakespeare grabs you initially, if it does, and I hope it does, through the stories. You know, you as a kid, there I was enchanted, you know, by stories of witches and ghosts and shipwrecks and fairies and all those things. And then you begin to realize that actually he's talking about your experience of love or jealousy or whatever that is. And then he may work on a more political level or a more psychological level. And I think that's what I love about Shakespeare, is that I think your experience of him and your journey with him grows as you go on. To me, he's been a passport through my life. And there are plays, you know, it took me a very long time to get round to doing King Lear, and probably because I didn't understand it, and probably because I was fearful of it, because my own father had, at the end of his life, succumbed to dementia. I don't think King Lear has dementia, actually, but that's what it seemed like. And I couldn't watch the play. I just couldn't watch it.
Quick question from Simon. Which Shakespeare play do you think you understand best, or it most personifies you?
Oh, God. Oh, crikey.
Go for it.
I think Midsummer Night's Dream, because ultimately it is full of joy.
And Amy says she's one of your she's a huge fan of you. She'd love to be more involved in the RSC. How can teachers and others become more involved in the RSC?
Lots of ways, and get online and have a look in any of those sites, and certainly in terms of the education department, in the way that we hold symposia, we hold all series of workshops, both here in Stratford. We have a huge network. We work with about 500,000 kids, 500,000 kids a year. We have a Shakespeare ambassador program for young people. We have an associate schools program. There are lots of ways. Get online and look, and you'll find those, I should think.
And final question is from Adrian Hilton, who says, hello, Greg, I'm an RSC alumnus and hold the Guinness World Record for performing the complete works of Shakespeare non-stop. I have no idea what that means. I was in Singer with Tony Sher, and paraphrasing the question, how can we make certain that that Shakespeare is still as relevant and wonderful as ever?
Oh, well, I know your work, Adrian, so keep doing it. I mean, it's I'm sure it is about making sure that the craft of doing Shakespeare is not ignored. It does take craft, but that craft is being passed on. And all the people that I've been talking to, all the people I've been talking to on Talking Shakespeare, talk about handing on what they have learned. And all Shakespeare's doing in terms of his writing is to write clues into the text so that the plays can become more vivid. I remember doing the workshop with the Titus Andronicus South African cast with John Barton, and we made up a list at the end of the workshop, and he said, what should we title this? And somebody said, well, how to speak Shakespeare's verse. And John said, no, let's title the list, How to Make an Audience Listen. And there's a profound and important difference there. It's about how you get the audience to engage with that difficult language, not about how to speak verse, because then there seems to be only one way to do it, and a whole load of intimidating nonsense being talked about what it should or shouldn't be. And I think it's important that the craft survives. But yeah, I think there's more interest in Shakespeare than there ever was. I remember in 2016 for the 400th anniversary thinking, gosh, it is extraordinary how far this reaches, and how many different worlds and disciplines and art forms it has inspired.
I'm sure that is true. Greg, and the fact that it is true owes a great deal to the work of the Royal Shakespeare Company and to you and the brilliance of your productions and your leadership of the Royal Shakespeare Company over the last 8 years, and particularly now everyone listening will want to extend their warmest sympathy and gratitude to you for keeping the flame alive at this time, and earnestly hope for the opening again of the theatre doors and coming back to the magic of productions by the Royal Shakespeare Company. Greg, from all of us, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thanks, Anthony. That's a great pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.